Now, Mr. Helmer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Prodi tells us that we should be developing biomass, but of course he must have seen the reports that show that the actual emissions savings consequent on using biomass are much less than previously thought and are extremely disappointing. And at the same time, use of land, of agricultural land for biomass is very damaging to food prices and food security. Mr. Termes tells us there is nothing we can do about the cost of gas. Now that, Mr. Chairman, is a highly defeatist point of view. We should break out of our European inward-looking mindset and look across the Atlantic at America, where gas prices have halved because they've taken a very positive approach to developing shale gas. We have shale gas in Europe. We should be urgently investigating and exploiting it. The curious thing, Mr. Chairman, is that while we regard America as the bad guys on the environment, in fact, in the last 5 years, their emissions have reduced, and their emissions have reduced because they are switching from coal to much cheaper gas. In the meantime, EU emissions have risen despite all our various policies and our renewables. And an important thing for this committee to get its head round is the fact that renewables, and I'm thinking particularly of wind, which is the primary renewable, simply does not save significant emissions. There are several studies, and I can give colleagues details if they're interested, showing that if you take the system of wind plus the necessary conventional fossil fuel backup, which you have to have because the wind is intermittent, you run the backup inefficiently because you run it intermittently, and the total emissions from the system of wind and backup show that the emission savings are somewhere between trivial and zero. And that is why we in Europe, despite all our wind farms, are not in fact reducing emissions at all. And we are driving up energy prices and making Europe hopelessly uncompetitive against America, which has cheap shale gas, China and India, which are building cheap coal-fired power stations very rapidly. It's no good Mr. Rubig asking for youth unemployment to be resolved if we're driving up energy prices and preventing economic growth. And I'd like to conclude, if I may, Mr. Chairman, with a question which colleagues may be able to help me with. But there have been extensive media reports saying that Germany, having foolishly decided to abandon nuclear power, is now in fact building coal-fired power stations in significant numbers. What I cannot understand, and I'm proposing to do a written question to the Commission, I can't understand, given Europe's large combustion plant directive, quite how the Germans are going to get away with building their coal plants, but no doubt that situation will become clearer over the course of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Goebbels first, and then I will give the floor to you, Mr. Helmer.
Yes, Chair, I had no intention to intervene in this debate, but as we have now, for once, a real discussion, only a short comment on shale gas. I agree with Roger Helmer that we in the European Union should look into shale gas too, especially as there is a lot of shale gas in different European countries. And I can't agree with my good friend Claude Turmes when he is saying that it's not necessary to look into shale gas in Europe because we will end up with the same prices. I always thought that we had something like competition policies in the European Union, that we were fighting for more competition. What I see is that some countries simply want to prevent exploitation of shale gas, and I'm pretty convinced that we will end up by doing it, but as usually long after all the others.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I broadly agree with that intervention. I appreciate there is a big difference between the European market for gas and the American market for gas, largely because the Americans are much more entrepreneurial. But it's an absolute basic rule of economics that if you have an increase in supply, you tend to bring prices down, and if you have a shortage, you tend to take prices up. And it is quite possible, as the Greens are always telling us, that fossil fuel prices will go up in future, but they will go up an awful lot less if we have an additional supply. The other point that I would make in response to Claude is a very clear one. At the moment, the Russians have a sort of pseudo monopoly on the supply of gas, and it's well known that the Russians are desperately trying to prevent Europe from getting into shale gas because they fear the impact it will have on their market and their prices. So I am absolutely confident that if we find significant amounts of shale gas in Europe, it will tend to bring prices down from where they might otherwise have been. Whether we will halve gas prices, as the Americans have, I don't know, but it must be better to do it than not do it.
Thank you very much.